Well, what a mess. I need to do a third part on this terrible, terrible response by Big Joel to the Red Pill. Hopefully I'll be less repetitive this time, but that depends on how repetitive his arguments are again.
In mind, let's jump forward to the next and last major argument that the film makes. That men face sexual assault and intimate partner violence that people don't care enough about.
I'd say violence in general as well. I mean, there's no violence against men and boys strategy, or violence against men office, or violence against men act, or so on.
The movie spends a lot of time and energy discussing this issue. We can see it as the emotional centerpiece of the film, and I think that's for very good reason. Men do face intimate partner violence and sexual assault, and more than that, these issues don't see enough attention.
Cool. Now I'm just waiting to see where the but comes in.
The section starts with portraits of roughly 5 men describing their experiences with intimate partner violence and sexual assault. This man was abused when he was a child. This man's wife abused him. This man knows a guy who was abused and who the system failed.
So I called a bunch of domestic violence shelters. I just looked around online and I called, but every place that I called said, we don't help men.
I don't have any problem with these interviews. In fact, I'd say that if the film has any saving grace, it's that it provides survivors a place to talk about their experiences. Here, we have the first claim that the section wants to make. Men are abused, and it's a problem. So far, so good. There's not a lot of people who would disagree with that, and neither would I.
Well, that's nice to hear, but there are also things that we're not hearing. He is a feminist. Those domestic violence shelters that don't allow in male victims, those are run by feminists, and it's feminists that secure the funding for them and that make sure that they don't allow in male victims. That is ultimately the root of this problem. Violence would happen anyway. Violence happens whether there are shelters or not, but the effects of that violence are very different depending on how society responds and how legislation and government policy are set up.
After this, Cassie J has a short monologue where she starts to position male abuse as a systemic issue.
Yeah, those sorts of systemic issues are the whole point of this documentary.
In the United States, there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters. All of them serve female victims, and nearly all of them turn away male victims. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Sure, there's a slight majority of female victims, but how can that excuse denying men help? Couldn't this be considered gender discrimination?
Notably, Cassie J included some actual citations at the bottom of those quotes there. That's a good choice. And those are pretty conservative estimates. She could have just as easily found citations for men being a majority of victims, or for most victims being in mutually violent relationships, which is generally the case. I doubt that Big Joel will do the same.
Her main citation here is that even though men and women face similar problems with intimate partner violence, women benefit from the 2,000 abuse shelters in America, while men have fewer places to go to in these situations. In some ways, I think this argument is pretty reductive.
Joel really loves the word reductive, but it doesn't seem to mean anything consistent. In this case, I think it just means he doesn't like it. He doesn't like the fact that this argument proves him wrong, I suppose. Proves that, yeah, men are victims too and could use some help. So he just calls it reductive because he hasn't actually got an argument against it.
It's very easy to look at the CDC statistics and conclude that male and female intimate partner violence is roughly the same, and so we should handle them in the same way. But ultimately, that assertion fails to get at a few important intricacies. Abuse doesn't express itself in the same way across gender lines.
The biggest difference, and this is something that Joel is definitely not going to mention, is in administrative abuse. Abuse of process. It's, in terms of custody, for example, it's generally going to go to the woman, so if you're threatening someone with loss of access to children, that's really only something that can go one way. If you're threatening a false accusation, if you're threatening to call the police and accuse someone of domestic violence, for example. Again, that can really only go one way. Most male victims who call the police are actually more likely to be arrested than their abusers. Statistically, that's the case. A man who calls the police to report that he has been a victim is more likely to be arrested than his abuser. But these special forms of abuse that are only available to women, definitely not what Big Joel's going to talk about.
While it's true that things like controlling reproductive behavior and emotional abuse are perpetrated in roughly equal amounts by men and women,
I think this idea that men are somehow manipulating the reproduction of women in the same way that women do with men is pretty ridiculous. Like, it's basically impossible, and he doesn't provide any sort of citation despite repeatedly using this statistic, so I'm just going to ignore that and discredit it.
patterns of dangerous and life-threatening behavior are more commonly experienced by women.
Maybe. If you look at the US government statistics, women commit about 29% of cross-sex domestic homicide. So yeah, that would be less common. But 29% of victims of domestic homicide doesn't really comport with having 0% of the shelter resources, which is what he's effectively defending here. And that's before we get on to whether the statistics are accurate, given that women tend to use poison and other less detectable methods of homicide, and are probably more likely to get away with it, given that women are more likely to be found not guilty when claiming self-defense than men are. In fact, about 10 times as likely to be found not guilty when claiming self-defense. The fact that most female domestic homicide perpetrators will sign up a man, say a boyfriend or something like that, to help them to commit the murder, or in some cases will hire a hitman. And those count as multi-offender homicides rather than domestic homicides. And of course we're not counting suicides driven by false accusations or caused by instances of domestic violence against men. We're also not counting, or rather really not considering, the statistics that existed in the past, which were actually very different. Yes, it's true, 29% now of US domestic homicides are female on male, but in the past that was considerably more. As recently as the 70s it was almost exactly 50-50. With the rate of female on male domestic violence decreasing as the number of shelters available to women has increased. Now, I don't know why that is. Maybe those shelters are being used by abusers. Maybe the abusers realise that they can use abusive process. They can just divorce their partners instead of murdering them. They can go to a domestic violence shelter, get legal aid in attaining custody, in securing property, in getting restraining orders. Just generally continue to abuse their former victim with the help of the shelter in a way that men can't. Maybe this is the mirror image of what used to be called battered woman syndrome, that men murder their partners, in part at least because they're in a situation where they are being abused and can't escape. It's worth noting that the biggest contributing factor to women becoming victims of domestic violence is having committed violence against their partners. But even assuming the 29% figure is accurate, that still doesn't justify 0% of shelter spaces.
In a 2000 study by the Center of Policy Research, they found that 4.5% of women reported being sexually assaulted by a partner in their lifetime, where the number is 0.2% for men.
So I tried to find this study. He does leave a list of citations in the description of the video, but they're not listed, they're not labelled, it's just a list of links. I went through them, as far as I can tell there's no link to that study. But there's only one way that you can get figures like that for sexual assault, which is to not count male victims of women, to not count victims of made to penetrate. So it seems to me like he's cherry-picked the study with poor methodology to give him the results that he wants, and then not provided a link to it so that it can't be debunked.
They found that 20.4% of women were physically assaulted, while the number is 7% for men. And as we approach the most life-threatening forms of abuse, the numbers become more starkly different. Women are astronomically more likely to get beat up or be choked.
Indeed, it says that women are 16 times as likely to be beaten up, and yet we know that they are only 3 times as likely at most to be murdered, which makes me think that this is a very, very suspect source of information. But of course I can't check it out because there's no link to it.
None of this stuff contradicts the CDC's findings, mind you.
Actually it does, yeah, like it literally contradicts it because it shows much lower numbers, presumably from very different methodology, but again, I can't check because he refuses to say where it came from.
Women are not perfect, they're sometimes abusive to men, but the experience of being in danger with someone you're living with, a situation that necessitates having an immediate place to go, is something that's seen by many more women than men.
Again, being murdered barely twice as likely for women as men, even according to the official statistics. But it could be 50 times as likely, and that still wouldn't justify the current ratio of spending on domestic violence shelters and services.
All that said, I can't be too mad at this claim. Like, I'm not opposed to male abuse shelters or to abuse shelters that accept men. While I do think the movie understates the reasons why there are more shelters for women, that doesn't mean we shouldn't develop an infrastructure for men who face these issues. And if the movie had stopped here, there's a good chance that I wouldn't be writing any of this right now.
Well, that rather raises the question of why he said the things that you just said. Why did he go and find that cherry-picked study with the ridiculously off-balance representation of violence between men and women? It's certainly not because he thinks, yeah, there really is an issue with male victims, and maybe they should have shelters too. I don't know, guys. But we'll see what he's going to say next.
But after the discussion of the asymmetry in abuse shelters, Cassie J, with the help of the other Red Pill participants, comes to the following conclusion.
So why aren't men's rights activists and feminists working together? Michael Kimmel briefly said something that made me wonder. He said it would no longer be a gender problem if both men and women were equally victims of domestic violence. Is that why the number of male victims are never addressed?
Is that why Big Joel is providing these very unreliable studies, so that he can make it look like there are less male victims than there are? Certainly sort of seems like that, doesn't it? But yes, the gender hypothesis and the violence hypothesis are the two ways to look at domestic violence. One says that it's basically just another violent crime that happens to happen in the home and in domestic relationships. The other says that it's a form of patriarchal terrorism that's done by men to control women and to keep them in their place. The violence hypothesis has all of the evidence. In fact, Ellen Pence, who came up with the Duluth model that effectively codifies the gender hypothesis, she herself has come out and said that it was nonsense. It was basically confirmation bias on the part of her research team. And it's been used ever since to justify keeping all services open to women only, keeping all spending on women only and female victims only. And whether it's because female-only services want to keep the money, whether it's because they don't believe that there are male victims, whether it's just because they're bigoted and don't like men and have their ridiculous feminist ideology, doesn't really matter, because the outcome is the neglect of male victims.
The treatment of male abuse has been concealed by feminism. There is a vested interest that gynocentrists have in pretending that men are not abused. To put what Jay says another way, if we started caring about men, feminism could no longer function. The world would take the red pill and feminist ideologies would come crashing down.
Well, we have the statistics from the CDC and from meta-analyses going back over decades. We know that the instance of violence is not, as he seems to want it to be, like 90% plus by men. We know that's the case. We know that feminists continue to produce dishonest research to try and show that is not the case. We know that some feminists have come forward to say that the reason they did that was specifically to keep the feminist narrative going. We know that feminist organisations completely dominate funding, and including, obviously, funding for domestic violence shelters. But like I say, it doesn't really matter what the motive is. It doesn't matter if the reason that they tell these lies is because they don't want to lose funding, or because they're biased against men, or whatever else. What matters is the outcome. The outcome being that lots of abusive women get custody of children and things like that because they have legal support from the shelter network, whereas men, no matter how victimised they might be, don't get that research, and some die because of that.
It kinda looks like each of the claims support each other. First, men are abused. Second, society is very poor at dealing with abused men. Third, feminism seeks to conceal the reality of male abuse. There's an emotional through line here, a sense of narrative closure.
There's really no emotional anything. This is a pretty straightforward ABC logical argument.
The fact is, though, those first two claims have literally nothing to do with the conclusion. The idea that feminism, the modern political movement in America, has been doing this really horrible thing to men is the sort of thing that would require a mountain of proof, and that proof is just not there.
Well, again, we have the words of Ellen Pence, who literally devised the entire system that feminists use to judge modern domestic violence cases, the Luff model, in other terms, the gendered hypothesis. But also, how many battered women's shelters are run by feminists? Maybe it's not all, but it's certainly getting on that way. And how many of them try to admit men? I'm going to guess that the answer is 0, but I'm certain that it's very close to 0. This is something feminists have the power to do that could seriously help victims of domestic violence, and they choose not to because it would help men. I don't really see a counter-argument for that, and certainly there isn't one coming from Big Joel.
Where are these male abuse-denying feminists at?
I refer you back to earlier in the video where he came up with some weird study that supposedly shows women being more likely to get beaten up by 16 times. Again, it's him. It's the people who came up with that study, it's the people who promote the Luff model, it's the people who run female-only shelters and campaign to make sure that funding stays with female-only services. I mean, the fucking irony of this statement, after what he was doing earlier in the video.
Like, if feminists refuse to acknowledge that men get abused, you'd think we'd be able to notice, since they'd be busy never talking about men getting abused and not caring why they're abused. But that doesn't seem true. I did a brief Google search and found all these articles that were written long before this movie came out. There's an everyday feminism one called 7 Types of Abuse We Don't Take Seriously, which talks a lot about the problem of male abuse.
So his argument that feminists take domestic violence against men seriously is that he found one website with a list of 7 types of violence not taken seriously enough. One of those was violence against men. 2,000 shelters run by professional feminists who refuse services to male victims, but yeah, that everyday feminism article with one of the 7 things on the list being about men, that disproves the whole thing. Well done you.
And there's a Cosmopolitan article which gets at the issue too.
Number 9 on a list of 14 in an article in Cosmopolitan. Yeah, that doesn't really counterbalance, say, Ellen Pence, or any of the Luff model promotion, the police training that feminists do. I was reading recently a bench book, a judicial guidance from a province in Australia, which says that they ought to interrogate male victims to make sure that they didn't actually commit violence. Of course, this is very much not the case with female victims, and to be fair, it's not the case with male victims who allege homosexual abuse. But yeah, that's somewhat, to me, outweighs the one list item in a Cosmopolitan listicle.
I'm not saying these publications are the heights of scholarship, but see, that's kind of my point. If there was a conspiracy among feminists to act like male abuse didn't exist, you'd think that these low-tier pop liberal sites would be the worst offenders.
No, I think that the people with a direct financial interest would be the worst offenders. Those would be the shelters who refuse to admit male victims or to allow funding to go to services that do provide for male victims. Or I'd expect that the biggest offenders would be the professional academics, people like Ellen Pence who have come forward about their wrongdoing. Or people like whoever did the study that he relied on before, which again wasn't cited, so I don't know who they are.
But they're not. They don't ignore these things, so who is?
Also, I don't really regard 2 items in out of 21 in a couple of listicles as being evidence that violence against men is taken really seriously, even by this particular pair of feminist listicle writers. Sort of seems more like they're downplaying the whole thing, damning with faint praise in a sense.
I guess this random feminist person in the movie does, but she hardly seems representative of a pattern.
On the whole issue of domestic violence, that's just another word, really. It's a cleanup word about wife beating, because that's really what it is.
Executive Director of the Feminist Majority Foundation is not representative of feminism. Someone who wrote a listicle for Cosmopolitan is representative of oh, for fuck's sake. Seriously, can Big Joel really believe this stuff? Like, the executive director of the Feminist Majority Foundation, and it's just like, forget it. She's not a feminist. She's not one of us. She's not one of the good ones. She's just some no one they dredged up for this documentary. Now, this Cosmopolitan listicle, that's where you find the real feminists.
See, there's a part of the Red Pill where the Honey Badgers, a group of female anti-feminists, talk about male abuse.
Really got to object to the term male abuse here. It's abuse of men. When you say male abuse, you're talking about abuse by men, right? Like you talk about male achievement, you're not talking about something that someone achieved on men, right? You're talking about something that men did, or that a man did. So by framing it as male abuse, it very much seems to be trying to blame this whole thing on the victims.
I have no doubt that many men feel shamed into not reporting domestic violence because to do so would be to admit weakness and be seen as effeminate. But this idea isn't transgressive or meaningfully anti-feminist.
Well, it certainly can be. You see, the shame thing is real, but it's also relatively minor. Yeah, a lot of men are probably shameful of being victims, but also, for that matter, so are a lot of women. You hear this from rape victims quite a lot, being ashamed of having been violated like that. The thing is, if a man is thinking of reporting domestic violence to the police, he's got much bigger problems than shame, being more likely to be arrested than his abuser. That's a much bigger problem. Having almost zero chance of getting a restraining order against his abuser, having no shelters to go to, having zero chance of accessing funding that comes through shelters. In America, for example, the Violence Against Women Act contains funding for transitional housing assistance. 99% of that goes to women. And for legal aid, 96% of that, I believe, goes to women. And these are real problems. These are much bigger problems than feeling shame, because you can overcome shame. You can do something even though it's going to make people think potentially less of you. But if you're going to get arrested for doing it, that's a much more concrete material obstacle.
I'm not like an authority on this stuff, but it seems like one of the most important aspects of feminist theory is the notion that gender roles can and should be challenged.
Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, here's toxic masculinity rearing its all ugly head. But in my experience, what feminists want is for the gender roles of women to be questioned and ultimately abolished to give women more freedom. I don't see feminists questioning child support laws that enforce traditional gender roles on men. I certainly don't see them questioning rape laws that say that women can't even be prosecuted for rape, or that rape has to be done by a penis or whatever. And obviously in this case, the old-fashioned right-wing chivalry, where you offer extra protection to women because they're small and helpless or whatever, that's feminist policy. That's keep these shelters for women.
MRAs might object to some of the words in a feminist's vocabulary, might think using phrases like toxic masculinity to describe this stuff is hurtful.
It's victim blaming, yeah, and if you're going to place the blame on the victim, then you're not likely to actually solve the problem, because you're not really dealing with what's actually causing the problem to exist in the first place.
But that seems like a very strange hill to die on to me.
Hey, it's feminists who insist on using the term toxic masculinity. They're the ones who are choosing to die on this hill. This isn't an issue that MRAs created.
Feminists agree that there's a problem. Men are abused.
Again, he says this after putting up a study that says that women are like 20 times as likely to be abused, in clear contravention of the actual facts.
And they agree on some of the reasons for that problem. Men and the government both agree that men can't be abused because of various masculine scripts.
Men and the government agree that men can't be abused. What the fuck are you talking about, pal? This is the big problem with feminists. Like, MRAs like to talk about policy, you know, I'm here talking about statistics and police training and government policy and stuff, and he's just got these bizarre pronouncements that men are doing various bizarre and strange things. It's hard to even argue with, because how do you argue with men and the government say men can't be abused? Like, what the fuck's that about?
So how exactly can the film sustain the idea that feminists don't care, that they hide the reality of partner violence to continue peddling their nonsense rhetoric?
Yeah, for Big Joel, that's enough. You know, you say toxic masculinity, and that's enough. That counts as dealing with domestic violence. You can run a domestic violence shelter that explicitly excludes male victims, but you say toxic masculinity, and you're trying to help those men out.
But what really gets me about this conclusion is how deeply unnecessary it all feels. We have a men's rights issue in front of us here. Men face problems when it comes to intimate partner violence, and those problems aren't adequately dealt with by the state. That could have been the end, right?
You haven't really dealt with the issue if you haven't dealt with causes. And in this case, the cause is feminism. Feminism monopolizing funding and research, political power, even public attention on issues of this sort.
Part of what makes living in a big society good is that we can deal with problems that aren't common. Yes, women are abused more and in general more seriously, but that doesn't mean we can't do things when stuff happens to men. We can do two things at once, and that's cool.
Well, tell feminists that, Big Joel. Tell the domestic violence shelters that. Because whenever any funding comes up for domestic violence, they want to monopolise it. They want to monopolise it for their services. In this country, Women's Aid, one of the biggest national shelter networks, they ran a campaign to prevent any form of gender-neutral provision because they wanted to keep all the funding. They thought it was important to keep it all focused on women. I mean, they are called Women's Aid after all. You've probably seen that one coming. So maybe society could do it for men and women. Maybe there could be a separate but equal system. That always works out well after all. But for as long as attention and lobbying power and funding is all with feminist organisations, it can never happen.
Now, if you're an MRA who's watching this right now, I think I can maybe guess what you're thinking.
I am an MRA who's watching this right now, so I suppose we'll see if he really can guess what I'm thinking.
This movie isn't about feminism or women or any of those things you said. So many people in the film say, I don't disagree with feminism about everything. Women and their politics don't represent the most important threat to men.
No, actually, that's basically the opposite of what I was thinking. I'm sure a lot of people in the documentary are quite conciliatory towards feminism, especially when talking to Cassie J, who used to be one, but I'm not. I do not like feminism. I think it's inherently bad and probably always has been. Good for advancing the position of women, I'm sure, and when there were forms of disadvantage that affected women, I'm sure that meant it could have a positive effect. But consistently pro-female and anti-male, and inherently bad because of that.
So where do the men's movement and feminism disagree?
Well, only on the fundamental belief that the women's movement says men are the oppressors.
Yeah, like a common conception among feminists is that men have advantages, and obviously Joel doesn't care about quality of life, but the reality is that men have a lot of disadvantages that feminists just don't really want to talk about, and certainly don't want to do anything about. Well, man is the N-word of the world.
So when I start criticizing feminism, I want you to know you're just part of the problem. They're just part of the problem.
The Red Pill is about men's rights and the ways they suffer. And if you have a problem with talking about that, it's just your anti-male bias speaking. It has nothing to do with what goes on here.
Yes, feminism is the problem. And yes, that's going to continue to be the problem for as long as it is in any way similar to how it is today.
But if that's true, if the movie isn't about feminism or the ways that society privileges women over men, why do all of its three major arguments culminate in that same silly place?
Why do these arguments about systemic injustice end up being very silly by talking about the cause of that injustice? Yeah, great question, Big Joel.
Men are abused and people don't care enough. But also, feminism is a modern-day conspiracy that fights to keep men abused and maintain the flawed belief that abuse is a gendered issue.
A reminder that that's the effective position of the person who created that power and control wheel. So that's about it. And Little Joel, Big Joel, they're both the same person, is really the worst of all of the online feminists as far as I'm concerned. At least the ones who pretend to care about men's issues. And I don't really want to address anything he says in the future.
Okay, that's all. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.